I think it's funny that Varsha and my comfort position is identical. Oh, you moved.
I did, but I felt like it was unprofessional, but whatever. I don't care.
Yeah. It's our webcast, Varsha. You can do whatever you want.
Okay.
When I did my orals for comps, I went out and they brought me back in and they're like, you did great, you're fine, you passed. So we have one major critique. You need to learn how to sit in a chair before you My old advisor was like, you took your hair up and put it down 12 times. I counted.
No, I had the same problem, even though I was in a Zoom orals. So while I was taking orals, I would just like keep switching and switching.
Yeah.
And like one of the advisors afterwards was like, I don't know, Varsha, I enjoyed like the really intense background full of bookshelves, but I felt like you kept moving too much. You need to be less fidgety. And I was like, that's not gonna happen.
My students make fun of it a lot because I always find myself in positions I don't even realize if I'm really paying attention to what they're saying and guiding a conversation and not paying attention to my body. And I used to teach in this classroom with really wide window ledges, and I would often end up crouched like a weird little crow on a window.
I took a seminar from a very well-known historian at Berkeley, who I will not name, who did that every graduate course too. So that is not an abnormal thing for history faculty.
Yeah. After all.
Yep.
So,
okay.
Anyway.
Well, now that it's 3:01 and we're still waiting for people to join in, but just to introduce everyone, this is Drinking with Historians. We are on episode 5 now, right?
Yeah.
But again, it is not a podcast. We are going to make sure to answer. We are going to make sure to answer your questions. It is a webinar. So if you have questions for Dr. Brown while we're talking, put them in the Q&A, and we will make sure that since we're going a little bit past half an hour, we're going to make sure to try to answer as many of them as we can. So besides Matt Gabriel, who's from Virginia Tech, we have me. If you don't know me yet, I'm a grad student at Berkeley. And this week we have Willa Hammitt Brown, who's a historian. She focuses on gender, memory, environmental history, and she's currently finishing her first book, which is Gentlemen of the Woods, Manhood, Myth, and the American Lumberjack. And I'm very excited to hear about it because I have done a lot of environmental history, but I know nothing about lumberjacking or its art. All I know about lumberjacks are Paul Bunyan and Johnny Appleseed. That's all I know about lumberjacks. So yeah, I think what we should start with is, what is everybody drinking?
Good question. I actually have 2 drinks, which feels a little embarrassing. But one is sort of just to piss Varsha off, because I've heard her mention not liking rum a lot. This is a homemade pina colada. There is a cherry in it. I lost it. I also really like, whenever people bring me onto things, I think they always expect me to show up in plaid with like a big thing of whiskey and an axe. So I really enjoy putting on a lot of makeup and drinking a pina colada. And then I have a Negroni because it matches my hair.
Nice. Those are 2 drinks I am not fond of. I have had them and I don't dislike them. It's just I don't choose them often.
Yeah, I mean, what Varsha and I usually don't talk about is how we spend an hour or so after every episode judging people by their drinks. So
basically, yeah. So people don't judge me. I'm drinking Larceny bourbon today, and I'm not putting ice in it. So I've been watching a lot of whiskey review videos online, and the biggest debate online, which is not shocking to me because it's the biggest debate I've had when I go out drinking with people, is whether or not to put ice in your bourbon or not. And I think it's 50-50 apparently.
I think you should. I feel like a little touch of water opens up. I don't know the phrases. That's how you say it, right? It opens up flavor. Do I sound knowledgeable?
It sounded perfect, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Are you drinking bourbon too, Matt?
I'm actually not drinking bourbon right now. I'm drinking rye. I posted this on Twitter, but I found a drink. So I like herbal alcohols called Amaros, which are usually from France or Italy. And there's one called Braulio, which has a real, it tastes like a pine forest to me. It's really amazing. And I thought, like, what better for talking about lumberjacks? Like, I need a drink that tastes like a pine forest. So I'm also wearing my Army of Darkness Bruce Campbell t-shirt because I figure we're going to be talking about masculinity, and what better way to talk about masculinity than Bruce Campbell. But anyway, so I made a cocktail with Braulio called the Palpable Apathy, which also is great for historians, which has rye, Braulio, and sweet vermouth, and it's just really lovely. It's a little bit bitter, but very nice. So if I can kind of jump us into kind of questions is I think that, you know, Willa, is the title of your book is just absolutely amazing, Gentlemen of the Woods, right? Because I think that gets at maybe some of that contradiction that we have in, you know, those of us, I as a medievalist, right, who don't know anything about lumberjacks, kind of have, right? We don't think of them as gentlemen. Like, so why'd you come up with that title? Like, how did this project start? Like, where did you, tell us about lumberjacks?
Yeah. So there's an answer that is the true and real and honest answer is I first came up with this project because between my second and third year, before my final year at Oxford, I was supposed to write a summer essay, and I spent all summer with access to the largest library in the English-speaking world, and I didn't use it. And then I got home and I hadn't written this essay, and the only archive near me was at this place called the Forest History Center. So I wrote a summer essay. I liked it. I turned it into my undergrad thesis. I decided that I needed to do something serious. So I applied to UVA to do serious things. I wrote a master's I hated on ideas of citizenship and before statehood. I wrote a couple seminar papers that I hated a little less. And then one night I showed up right before seminar at my advisor's office sobbing. And he said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "I hate everything that I'm working on." And he said, "Well, what's the solution?" And I said, I want to write about lumberjacks. And he was a man and so made very uncomfortable by this. So he gave me half his sandwich and told me that he was sure I could find an advisor with whom I could write about lumberjacks. And I did. There was a new 19th century person, a remarkable scholar, Elizabeth Barron. She also didn't know anything about lumberjacks, but she knows the questions. She's brilliant. And so she guided me through it. And the question that got me into all of this was what we think of lumberjacks versus what I learned that first summer when I started reading about lumberjacks. And this realization that everything I thought I knew, and I did think I knew some stuff. I've spent every summer of my life in the North Woods. I'd been to this lumber history center before, which is sort of, it's like the colonial Williamsburg of lumberjacks. You know, there are a bunch of people in old-timey costumes, and they won't break character. It's great. I love it. I'm obsessed with it. I'm obsessed with living history. But nothing I knew, which was all the brawny men and Paul Bunyan and this sort of cheerful masculinity that's non-threatening but really heroic, really friendly, big, white, burly guys out in the woods doing God's work, sort of at one with nature. None of that was true. Nothing I read in the archives chimed with anything I knew from culture. So I became obsessed with where that came from. And The Gentleman of the Woods is a direct quote. There's this sort of nostalgic vein that comes out as more and more immigrant jacks come in. They start getting really nostalgic for the old and real lumberjacks of the 1870s and 1880s who were Yankee stock. And they tell all of these stories that you sort of see reflected in Paul Bunyan, that fundamentally these are good guys. They would never harm a woman. You know, if a woman walked into a bar, they'd all give her their seat. They'd stand up for a buddy. And that, you know, they might seem rough around the edges, but at their heart, they were what gentlemen really are. They're the gentlemen of the woods. So I became obsessed with sort of that idea of the gentleman of the woods as this mythology that starts to grow around these guys.
Interesting. How does environmental history sort of fit in? I mean, it's sort of obvious to me if you're looking at the history of the lumber industry, environmental history is like the big part of it. But how does environmental history fit in with the history of gender? Or is it two parallel stories you're telling?
Oh, I think they're totally, I don't think you can talk about environmental history without, I mean, you probably can, but gender is so tied, especially masculinity, but our ideas of what's natural is so tied to our understanding of the natural world. And so you see this frequently, but this attempt to say gender roles, these gender roles come from nature, and these are people who are doing what's natural. And so environmental history came to shape it in a bunch of ways. One way is that sort of looking at the way we naturalize ideas about race and gender through the environment. So if anybody's ever read, there's Ed Ayers' book, not Ed Ayers, don't know why that name came out, because I was thinking his name will come to me in a minute. But there's a book on war and nature where he's talking about the way we portrayed the Japanese as bugs, and it's right around the time mass extermination of bugs became possible. And he talks about the sort of portrayal of enemies as insects, and warfare and all-out war as insecticide, as getting rid of vermin and infestations, and talks about how we map race onto nature and talk about controlling nature that way. So there's that side, which is how do we think about what's natural? Who's a man, who's not a man? What does a natural man look like? And then the other way is I just read way too much William Cronin when I was in grad school. And I am like a Cronin fangirl. I met him once. I got very weird. And
I'm sorry. I'm like
out right now. Yeah.
I'm geeking out.
Just losing her mind.
My dream is to meet William Cronin. Like, I know he doesn't really use Twitter. Like, every so often he'll tweet something and I actually have notifications for when he tweets. And so he doesn't actually engage with anybody online. But like, my dream is to meet the man, because I've read Nature's Metropolis and all of his other books at least like 3 or 4 times. It's like become an obsession.
It is sort of, and well, so let me tell you the incredibly stressful situation in which I met him. At the Western History Association this fall, I was presenting a paper that I was really unsure of, because the area that is big in my research that I always feel uncomfortable talking about is Indigenous history, because there's just so much and I know I don't know enough. So every time I'm asked to talk about it, I get very stressed. And it's probably what I've read the most of for the percentage read for what ends up in my book is all out of whack. And I was giving a paper on the Anishinaabe in the camps, last panel of WHA in Vegas. The only people I knew were coming were my sister and cousin, who had come because the conference was in Vegas. And there was one person in the room. And we walked in, it was 10 minutes before. I sat down next to one of the other panelists and said, I'm not wrong. And she was like, no, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
Oh my God.
He was
William Cronin's in the audience.
Students ended up coming, but otherwise the entire audience was my sister, my cousin, William Cronin, and one of his graduate students. It was incredible. It was like a mini seminar. He gave us all incredible feedback. It was great. But I became obsessed with these sort of ideas about geography. So for anyone listening who didn't go deep on their William Cronin at some point in life and isn't a huge nerd, one of the things he talks a lot about is sort of backwoods and centers. And I started thinking a lot about the geography of these dudes, because they get lumped in with itinerant laborers. And one of the things I ended up doing was going to anthropology and searching and learning a lot about linguistic anthropology to try to make an argument that actually there's a culture, but that culture circulates and it sort of ties together this whole region between the backwoods of the camps and these urban centers. So there was a lot of environmental history there too. And then the final part, and then I swear I'll shut up, is the fires that came out of the Northwoods lumber industry should be right up there in our understanding with the Dust Bowl as what happens when you let capitalism run rampant over a landscape. The deadliest fire in American history, up to and including, I believe, the Camp Fire. Yeah, included, because the Camp Fire was horrible, but not that deadly. Was not the Great Chicago Fire. It was not the Oakland Hills Fire. It was a fire that started in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, the same day as the Great Chicago Fire. killed over 1,000 people, ripped through 200 communities. And these happened across the Northwoods for about 2 decades, these huge firestorms, because they would clear cut and then leave everything to rot. And so in much the same way that environmental historians and Donald Worster helped us understand that, no, the Dust Bowl is not an accident. This is what happens when unregulated capitalism is allowed to eat up a landscape without planning, and then a season goes wrong. This is a very similar story of, we created these tinderboxes that then consumed communities, and everybody blamed it on sort of a natural disaster, which only now historians are coming to reread as man-made. I'm just trying to move out of this weird light bubble.
Yeah, so I'm a huge environmental history nerd in the sense that like a lot of my orals list was environmental history. I've taken multiple seminars on it, and besides being obsessed with Cronin, I'm also obsessed with Richard White and Donald Worster and all these people. So I was just wondering, do you get to teach environmental history a lot? And if you do, or even if you don't, how do you like, are your studies of lumberjacks focused on the Northwoods, or do you look at like nationwide?
I look at the Northwoods.
Okay.
That was a decision I made partially just for scope reasons. It's way too big. But then secondly, a lot of what we talk about is this mythology that emerges, and that mythology is hugely focused on the idea of whiteness. And there are a bunch of things that can point you to the Northwoods as where it comes from. One, this incredible archivist at the Wisconsin Historical Society finally sat down after like 100 years of people wondering where Paul Bunyan came from. And it's there. It's actually an advertising campaign. Sorry to break it to you. Paul Bunyan was made up for an ad campaign. There were existing stories of Paul Bunyan before that, but they were of a very different character. He was really mean. So there was a guy, William Lawhead, who wanted to advertise Red River Lumber. I'm sorry, I'm hoping somebody else in my house will stop the phone from ringing any moment. They did it. He made up this friendly character, and he wrote comic books, and he did that whole early 20th century ad thing. And that was out of Minnesota. And then the other thing is, if you look at the moment that we became obsessed with what is white masculinity, where are these white heroes, that's the 1880s, 1890s. It's a sort of Gilded Age obsession. And very, very much the lumberjack came out of the same thing as the cowboys. And similarly, they wrote out anybody who wasn't white. You know, we all know now, we knew then, we just pretended we didn't. The most cowboys are, in fact, Hispanic, like almost all of them. But we wrote all of that out, and the problem with lumberjacks anywhere except the Northwoods is it's really hard to write out the race, because most of the South was Black and most of the West was Chinese. So even when you see those sort of West Coast guys with the giant redwoods, they were definitely white people. But there was a book that came out 4 years ago that argued pretty definitively that up to 90% of the workforce was Chinese. So to make the lumberjack a white hero, it sort of ends up focusing more and more on Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan.
Interesting. And then my last question on the West, sorry, just one more. I also worked a little bit on Gifford Pinchot and like Teddy Roosevelt and that conservation era. Does like the rise of conservation, specifically this Teddy Roosevelt type conservation, affect the image of lumberjacks or lumberjack industry in general?
The industry sort of, the image not really. One of the things that I think is really interesting is, so I'm talking about these hideous fires. They go from the 1890s through about the 1920s. They leave this area totally impoverished. At the time, there was actually a mini Dust Bowl in Wisconsin during the Dust Bowl, but the old cutover, which is what they call it, where the woods had been, took 90% of Depression era aid for the state of Wisconsin, even though it only had like 20% of the population. This area is destroyed. Everything's gone. So how does an area that is utterly ruined by an industry come to be obsessed with that industry, which they are? Come up and visit. I'll show you the 72 Paul Bunyans. We can go to, I know of 4 recreation logging camps. One is really good and run by the Minnesota State Historical Society, but the others are questionable. There's Lumberman's Memorial in Michigan, like obsessed. We're obsessed. So how does that happen? And I basically argue a bunch of different stuff came together. It's complicated. But it's great when the historian's just like, it's complicated, never mind. You don't want but essentially the image of the lumberjack comes out not as a destroyer of the woods, but as sort of a man of the woods, at one with nature. And then in the 1920s and 30s, sort of relief and part of works, you know what I mean, the WPA, starts meeting a bunch of conservationists with the CCC, as well as a bunch of artists and writers who come to conserve the history, and they sort of build up the second growth forest to the point where by the 1950s, you wouldn't have known that it had been a tinderbox 40 years earlier, except that the forests are much more monocultures, but you'd have to know a lot about trees to be able to look at a forest and say, oh, that's not virgin, that's a second growth forest. I wouldn't have known. So yeah, they managed to miss out on it entirely on being blamed. The companies say that they were expanding American capitalism. They sell off the land as farmland, even though it's all scrubland and sand, because where pines grow, other things don't. That's not how ecology works. You can't replace pines with wheat. That's different soil. And they leave this area in total poverty, but sort of local boosters realize that tourism's the next round. And there's this huge nostalgia in big urban centers for rural experience. And so they sell Minnesota especially, all three of them, as untouched virgin wilderness, where leave the cities, get in touch with your authentic self, get back to nature. And the lumberjack becomes part of that, you know, be a lumberjack for the weekend, come here and be on their waters, be a real man, basically.
It's like living history, right?
Like living history.
Yeah, like living history. One of the things, I mean, I'm so fascinated by is that the way that you're describing your project, I mean, it cuts across so many kind of what, you know, we sometimes call subdisciplines within history, right? So it's like economic history, and it's environmental history, and it's cultural history. And so, you know, especially because you're so interested in kind of the representation of lumberjacks as well, like you were talking about that. And one of the things, I mean, I you know, you and I have known each other for a little while. One of the reasons we met was because you wrote an amazing piece in The Atlantic about lumbersexuals, right? Where this historical work is kind of bounded, but then the lumberjacks have kind of intruded into the present in this weird, interesting way. So like, how do you, because I think this is something that all historians, especially those of us who teach, you know, and continue to teach regardless of the level, have to deal with this. Like, how do you get people interested and talk about kind of modern relevances to these long ago type things, right? And I say that with quotes because I'm a medievalist, and you guys do basically current affairs. So. So anyway, so how do you deal with kind of these pop culture representations, which are so important in your research, but then kind of spring up in these different, weird, interesting ways?
In the past, yeah. I mean, there's sort of two parts here. One is the cuts across a million things, which like way to nicely touch on why I'm unemployable. But I listened to any graduate advisor who was kind of like, pick a lane, pick 2 lanes, pick 4 lanes, and I was like, no. I'm going to pick gender and gender and environment and cultural and memory. And like, I am also a history of capitalism. You know, pick no lanes.
These are the most interesting projects, though.
They're the most fun projects, too.
They are the most fun projects, yeah.
But I think the thing is, the lumbersexual moment was like an easy moment to tap into. And I think historians need to be conceiving of this. One of the things that my students have found most revelatory, and it's, you know, it's kind of easy to introduce, but doesn't occur to professional historians too, I think, because we understand this, is the line between memory and history. So I honestly use a speech David Blake gave once at Yale to the Gilder-Lehrman Association, and I use that as like my way into what's history, what's memory, and why is it important to think about. And as soon as you get a student to think, okay, these memories are created, these come from someplace, then everything is interesting. I mean, I was joking about this with Matt, and I were talking the other day about sort of teaching in this moment. And I was saying, you know, once upon a time, it used to be hard to convince people that the Middle Ages were relevant. And then people start showing up dressed as crusaders at Trump rallies. And you're like, well, don't need to worry too much about irrelevance anymore. Same with the Civil War. I mean, right now I spent all semester talking about Civil War statues with my students, and one of them was like, this is really interesting. I'd never thought about it. It'd be really interesting to, like, if this had a national conversation. I just wanted to write him an email yesterday. Your wish is my command.
So it was you. Thank you.
It was me.
Yes.
It was me. All the statues are coming down because it's just me. I think a lot of it is just that assumption that everything is interesting. And so if you can get any student to think of the thing they're into and say that has a history and there's a reason you're into it and there's a reason you think of it the way you do, then everything becomes exciting. That's what I like. That's what I think is cool. And I think myth and, Blight, many people make now, but he was sort of among the first to make this argument that just because something's memory doesn't mean we shouldn't study it. We need to study how that memory came to be. We need to study why we misunderstand the past. It's one thing to say, well, that's not history and move on. That's not right. The lost cause isn't valid. But it has such cultural importance. It drives culture. What drives culture is not, frankly, what we do, unless we can find a way to talk to people about what we do. And that's not to shit on anybody who writes a really obscure but important monograph that only historians read. Those ideas will eventually find their way out. Those ideas are really important to generate, and those conversations within the academy are incredibly important. But I think some of us, at least those of us who like to do it, it's worth thinking about, okay, Matt hosted a few years ago a conference on narrative and nostalgia that was on the Civil War and the Crusades and all of these intellectual cross-pollinations and the way people think about and remember and have nostalgia about these things. And it was this incredibly intellectually stimulating conference. But one of the things I appreciated is a lot of it was also, okay, now what do we do with this? So student activists came to speak. There was some sense of how do we take these ideas, and nobody's pretending that the public wants to read that monograph and those articles or do comps. Of course they don't. But we can, if we work at it, take those complex ideas and say, actually, you do care about these. These are worth talking about. These are worth thinking about.
I think that's what's so useful to me about environmental history is that it's worth thinking about, not just for, being able to fangirl over William Cronin, but specifically when you get to talk to people outside your field or who are not in academic fields at all. They understand why it's important not just to talk about how the environment has got to the way it is today, but specifically like distilling the term Anthropocene into something simple for people is really useful for them to understand climate change, right? So instead of like talking in academic speak about the Anthropocene and how we got to this place and why does the Industrial Revolution happen and can we escape it and all this stuff, if you can actually distill to them with a certain example. So I use water history and dams, you use lumberjacks and lumber. You could distill it to people who are, living in these communities with these environments around them, why the choices we've made for our environment have irreparably or completely transformed it. It's useful for them to understand why climate change affects them. And I think that's also true. There's a conversation going on today, not just about Confederate statues, but with Juneteenth just happened, I think a week ago. Everyone is talking about, I think it was either Jamel Bowie or somebody else who wrote an op-ed about enslaved people freeing themselves. And everybody who was not like paying attention in their high school history class freaked out. They're like, are you telling me Abraham Lincoln didn't free the slaves? And I'm like, no, man.
Like people who theoretically did pay attention in high school history.
Yeah, I think that's what really excites me about teaching history is that some people who not just pay attention, but who like seek out answers themselves will like totally reverse the myths and memories that we have told ourselves about, not just the Civil War or the American Revolution, but other obscure things,
Yeah, and the obscure, silly things are so worthy. Like part of the reason the Lumbersexual article was so fun to write is here's this incredibly dumb thing. Like Tech Junkie said there's a thing called a Lumbersexual. and they sort of described every dude I've ever dated. And I was like, yeah, okay. I get it. I see it. I know them. What if we use this as a moment to think about like masculinity over time? And you're right, the environmental history is one of those cool places. Like my brother-in-law, who's one of the, I mean, to be fair, he doesn't count in this because he has a master's in environmental science and policy. So like, he's not like your like random person who's uninterested. But our like big bonding moment was our realization that we both love William Cronin, and we really want to yell about like the division between natural and man-made. And it's really cool if you can connect whatever those things are. And of course, you're then going to get haters. Like you're going to get a million of those comments are going to be like, it's just a trend. Like, why are you doing this? And especially with the things that, to gender everything as I always will, but a lot of like cultural history is coming from women, and a lot of fashion history of pop music, history of thrifted clothing, a lot of it is coming from women. And so a lot of the sort of kickback comes in this gendered line of, well, we need to pay attention to the important things. I mean, if you read, I was referring to this National Review article today that I actually got to through Matt posting it on Twitter, I think, or subtweeting it on Twitter. That it was sort of like not all menning. The slaves freed themselves and were like, don't forget Lincoln. And I think that there's this weird like backlash that we're gonna somehow forget who was president if we try to spread other things out. And if we try to talk about lumberjacks or fashion, that we're all gonna forget diplomatic history. Yeah. Diplomatic history is fine, it's doing fine. You know, it's had a dip, but it's doing fine. Political history.
As a diplomatic historian, I agree with you. It's doing okay.
It's doing okay. Political history has not died because I have a real interest in talking about a housewife's diary from the 17th century. That is not, it also didn't mean that I was able to pass my comps without being able to, you know, do the was the American Revolution revolutionary debate. We all have to still do that. We're not killing it. It's just, I think a lot of people connect better with history when there's a great Macaulay quote, Macaulay's maybe what got me to be a professional historian, which is a weird thing to say, is like, as the internet would have me, a radical leftist feminist historian, that it was like a 19th century Whig man.
British colonialist.
Yeah. British colonialist.
I'm confused.
Is this line in, it doesn't matter. None of you are gonna look it up. In one of his essays, where he says that like what gets to him about history, what you wanna do is like open their odd wardrobes and rifle through their things and wonder what their furniture is for. And I think a lot of the sort of, once you start teaching college especially, I think it becomes really immediately apparent, is you get a bunch of kids who say, I hate history because I can't remember dates. And one of the things I always like to point out to them is I forget the day of the end of the Civil War constantly. April? It was in April. But like, you don't need to. I can look that up. What I can teach you to do is read a document and think about context. And what you'll learn eventually, if you study this forever, is a sort of gut instinct of what people in the Gilded Age thought about things. I still don't know the dates. I can look those up. It's fine. The dates aren't going anywhere. And when you teach in college, I think you start seeing that kids get really turned on by the idea that they're allowed to care about what they care about, and that they're allowed to think that's cool, and they're allowed to think that has a history.
That's why I love teaching primary sources. I'm going to be teaching the first part of the American Survey this fall, and most of the readings that the professor I'm teaching for assigns are primary sources, and it's the best thing ever, because some of these primary sources are wild, like especially when you go over the First Great Awakening and you're reading all these old white preachers just talking about salvation. They get really into it. And then the favorite collection of primary sources I get to teach are Antebellum Sex and Sexuality. And there's like a bit about like graham crackers and onanism. And so when you teach students this for the first time, they're like, wow, I did not learn this in high school. And I'm like, That's the best part about college, man. You get to realize that people in the 19th century were really, really worried about masturbation. And that does not detract from your understanding. Yeah, and that doesn't detract from your understanding about the Hartford Convention or whatever. So, yeah.
No, and it's so much more, by the way, if you ever have a chance to teach Dr. Edward Clark's Sex and Education, it's the 1880s, and he basically makes the argument that women don't have enough blood to think when they menstruate, so that by sending girls to school, we're causing them to become amenorrheal and therefore not women. It's fast. Wow. And he's like, this is a very straight-faced argument.
It sounds so familiar as a medievalist, right? Like, I mean, those arguments were made in the 12th century too, so.
Right. So why wouldn't they be?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just, I think, for me, I almost became a medievalist, and the thing that almost made me a medievalist was nothing I learned in school about cathedrals, cool as they are. It was when I got to go dig deep on monastic life, that once I got into like the daily schedule of monasticism and the way people thought about their lives, that's when you get hooked. It's easy to get history's cool.
Well, I think that's so amazing about so many of these episodes, but I mean, something you're bringing to life right now is like, we tend to think of the past as kind of existing in black and white, like in static, like these weren't actual real people who existed, but they were real people. Like, they thought about masturbation, they thought about eating breakfast cereal, they thought about, like, you know, what woods were like and what masculinity was and what it meant to be a man and stuff like that. So one of the great questions, I mean, I think since we're into the second half of the conversation now, which my wife says we should call drunk with historians and not drinking with historians. So we're gonna start that now. Is one of the questions we got from Q&A was about homosociality, and just like, was concern about homosexuality a big thing about the lumberjacks that you've worked on? You know, especially in logging camps, I would assume like they would be away from women for a long time, or maybe that's an assumption that's wrong or something like that. So how, like, homosexuality, like what can you say about that in lumberjacks?
One of the starting points that's always sort of hard when you read into the 19th century is the line between homosexuality and homosexuality. Because, you know, late 19th century is when we first start having the idea that sodomy isn't an act, homosexuality is an identity. That people are sort of attracted to men and only want to have sex with men, as opposed to, like, sometimes people have sex with men and sometimes they do it a lot, but it's an act, not a part of who they are. So one of the lines that's hard to draw is, like, a lot of people who would not consider themselves in any way homosexual might have had sex with men for all we know, and probably wouldn't have written it down. And then also there's this whole homosocial world that is sort of allowed by that not being an identity. This is one of the things a lot of people argue with the 1920s, is sort of the death knell for the heights of lesbianism, because as soon as women can be openly sexual, then they can no longer just be like sort of sexual with each other all the time. And so men are just sharing spaces. They're really close to each other. They're constantly sharing beds. You're sleeping 30 men to a camp, and there are no women. No women, no gambling, no fighting, no alcohol, although they did have patent medicine, and that patent medicine was never used. It was like 90% clean alcohol. It was kept in the camp store, and everybody knew what it was about. And there were rumors, though I've looked unendingly, that there were like weird stockaded brothels in the woods. Some women's rights campaigners in the 1890s became obsessed with this idea that there was like a white slave trade, but I couldn't really find anything to substantiate it. The only thing that I have one piece of solid evidence beyond homosexuality, beyond the fact that these men were together a lot and on cultural norms and assumptions, and basically sort of basing it off studies of sailors and other homosocial environments. I'm going to assume some of them were having sex. But there's a really interesting point in that identity formation, in that cigarettes were considered feminine, and they were nicknamed fairy sticks. And this is the real beginning of the idea of fairies, of men who only have sex with men. And there are a few places I've come across where one of the camp rules was that people could get fired for smoking cigarettes. because it was considered sort of a threat to camp morale to have a man smoking cigarettes because he might be a predator or undermining something. So that's really the only sign. I know there is a study on it in Canadian camps, but it's a little bit later. And in the 1920s, the sort of administrative eye was stronger. And so people are getting caught more, and these things show up in records more. In the 1880s and 1890s, it really just doesn't show up. We can only kind of go off assumption, which is probably,
That's really interesting. I have like a million questions mostly about like cigarettes but that's so strange. It just kind of confounds expectations. Somebody else asked though, I think kind of playing off this is that, you know, one of the things that kind of attracted you to this study was about kind of like we were just talking about was about the kind of reality of life, right? And some of it was about sex. It was about kind of like male to male relationships. Like, do you have like a favorite anecdote about the lumberjacks you study, like a favorite lumberjack or something like that?
I have a bunch of favorite lumberjacks, and a lot of them are small side things. So there's like Pig Eye Kelly, who used to stand on the streets and challenge anybody to fight him, and he'd use just his teeth. He was just a weird drunk. There are all these stories that get told.
Wait. Can you just pause for a minute? He would only use his teeth?
Yeah, he would kneel on the ground and fight them using only his teeth. They were allowed to use whatever they wanted. He would use only his teeth.
Whoa.
Did he win?
He was so famous. But like, what's funny is I heard a lot of people talk about him, and heard is such a weird thing. I mean, I read a lot of people talking about him, but these voices are so real to you at one point. But like, I never heard about anybody fighting him. I think he was just considered like harmless and crazy. But there's this very violent culture where like fighting a man is really important. You're not allowed to in camp. You sort of fight in town, and then you all buy each other drinks. To like, it's just sort of a proof of camaraderie. But he took it a step far. I love him. He's a great one. There a lot of them. There was one. God, when you said this, somebody occurred to me, and this is just a tiny one, but I loved it so much because I just love those moments in an archive where somebody like appears and reappears, and there's nothing more. You'll never find out the rest of the story, except that the story so obviously tells itself. So I'm looking through the newspapers of this town, Grand Rapids, because there was a camp on Lake Pekegama, and it was like this lumber town. And there's this little bit that shows up. It's sort of personal interest in the way 19th century papers would just sort of talk about people around. And it's this guy who lives on the North Shore. I can't remember his name. Let's call him Tom Ford. The designer won't mind. Like Tom Ford lives on the North Shore of Pekegama with his tame bear that he keeps as a pet and shows off for anybody. And then like months later, maybe even a year, I'm reading another thing, and there's a little notice that says on the north side of Pekegama, a man was killed, mauled by a bear in his home. And I was like, I know who
that was Tom Ford.
I think it might have even said bear, and I was like, Tom Ford. There you go. Yeah.
So somebody asked a really interesting question in the chat about no alcohols in the camps, but people can go into town and fight and drink. So why are camps so restrictive? And is that for like a certain reason? Is that self-regulated or is that imposed?
Very imposed. One thing to remember is how far most of these camps are from town. So when people are going into town, and especially in the early years, I don't mean during the winter. You didn't take your day off and go into town. You were often 30 miles walk from town. So you spent your winter not at the same camp. Actually, one of the most remarkable things I found is there's this like wild level of itinerancy, even though nothing's near anything. All of these men are just moving around on these backwoods roads all the time. But they wanted you to work. You worked from sea to no sea is what they called it. So you would get up in dark, breakfast in the dark, and in the dawn you would walk out to where the cut was, where you were working. You'd work all day, your lunch would be brought to you out at the cut, and then you'd walk back in twilight and eat your dinner in darkness. And it was considered that because they lived in such small quarters, you know, you'd have somewhere between 20 and 80 men in a single bunkhouse, that alcohol could lead to fighting. Fighting was fighting in and of itself. Alcohol could also lead to hangovers. Lumberjacks were kind of notorious drunks. There was also a lot of what they considered racial, what we would call ethnic hatred within the camps. So there was a sense that you want to take away as many excuses to kill each other as possible. And the work is so dangerous. During World War I, there was a higher casualty rate among lumberjacks and soldiers. It's so dangerous that you need people to be on their game, awake, alert, and you need them to work in teams. And given that they hate each other on ethnic grounds, if you add fighting and gambling and women and drinking, then like a camp falls apart. It just, so it wasn't, the men hated it. It wasn't self-imposed at all. But.
Okay.
So when you, so can I follow up on this actually? So you mentioned this kind of earlier about, you know, the importance of whiteness in the construction of kind of lumberjack identity, and how in certain areas, like it's hard to kind of write out because there were so many, or at least it's a much more conscious decision in the West and the Southwest, you know, about the kind of the populations in these camps. So like in the North Woods, the kind of your focus, like who were these guys? Like where did they come from? Were they just like local guys, or did they come from all over? Were they white? Were they, you know, kind of Norwegian stock or something like that? Like
yeah. I mean, also like define white. There's one of my favorite letters I have is this letter from a guy who's sort of a middle-class guy from Minneapolis, and he spent one winter there to earn his tuition for the University of Minnesota up in a camp. He wrote home a lot, and I was reading his letters, and he has this thing where he says there are 15 white men here and 60 Swedes, which is just such a statement on like how our idea of whiteness has changed over time. That there are 15 white men and 50 Swedes. The white men presumably are Yankee stock, possibly German. French were often considered white. The Swedes and the Norwegians weren't. So the first round was Norwegian, French, Canadian. Oh, not Norwegian, Yankee and French Canadian was how it started. But as it exploded, it was mostly Scandinavian immigrants. If you've ever been to the North Woods, like the number of oofta jokes and things like that were here. And then that was my own great-grandfather came from Sweden and worked in the woods briefly. And then the next round, and everybody hated the next round. So they always, you know, it's the sort of Nadia of how the Irish became white argument of like, you become white by making somebody else not. So next up was Finns and then Eastern Europeans, the Finns were the most hated. And then all this time, in all of these camps, in very small numbers, but there are the Anishinaabe. Less the Menominee, which is the major group in the sort of eastern part, because different treaty negotiations meant that they were logging their own land. But there are Anishinaabe workers sort of wandering around in all of these camps, but they're treated very differently. There's this sort of assumption among lumberjacks that they're just naturally good in the woods. So they don't treat them as sort of fellow workers. They just treat them as these sort of workers who show up and are good in the woods and can work next to them. And they actually seem to work next to them fine, but they're not sort of admitted to the fraternity of lumberjacks. There's very little violence against them in the woods. In towns, a whole other thing, unsurprisingly. Unsurprisingly, racism is racism, but in camps they tended to work well. But it was mostly what we would think of as white, what they thought of as sort of lesser European races.
So you're saying that racism has been a problem in American history beyond the past like year or so?
No, we didn't just invent it with George Floyd. I know.
Oh, so okay.
Weird. Yeah, it's not new. Yeah. And I'm also saying whiteness is not a thing.
Wow.
I know.
Makes sense. There's actually a really good question. So there's two good questions. One's more silly, but also we didn't get to ask you about pop culture. Another one is about capitalism. Since we talked about Worcester and Cronin, I was just wondering, how does the business side of this work? So is there like one boss of a camp, or are there like national companies that hire independent contractors who then work for these camps?
You're getting into the real nerdy side of this. Yeah.
I am.
Yeah.
Well, it's not us. It's our amazing listeners who are asking these great questions. We don't care. We just want to drink. That's the only reason we're here. So
exactly.
No one's here to hear about capitalism. So it wasn't as concentrated as the other sort of Gilded Age barons. but there were lumber barons. What's interesting is the camps are this really heterogeneous mix of European ethnicities. The lumber barons are almost all Yankee stock. It's a really small group. There is a whole bootstraps mythology, especially that comes out of the myth of lumberjacks, these hardworking men, and they go raise themselves up. Absolutely not. It's by 1890, it's an industrial working class. There's almost no chance because there is a management class, but the management class is hired separately and from outside. And so the big concerns, where the single largest, but there are a bunch of others. Interestingly, Rahala, which is one of the ones that showed up a lot in my research, I'm at a lake right now, and the Rahalas live across this lake. But they would own, if you were Weros, or you owned hundreds of camps. Smaller concerns would own 10 or 15, and they'd have what was called a walking boss. And the walking boss would go camp to camp to make sure they were all working. And then each camp would have a foreman that was hired by the company, a sort of scribe bookkeeper hired by the company. The foreman was called the push, which, way to just make it literal, lumberjacks.
Yeah.
And then he puts you to work, he's the push. And then the men would be separately hired by contracting companies in Duluth and all the sort of major cities. You would go to what they called slave markets. And that's where you'd basically be given a train ticket and enough money to get your last few drinks in town, and then show up at camp, and you were paid only if the contract was fulfilled. If the contract wasn't fulfilled, if you didn't cut enough wood during the winter, then you were only paid in room and board, which is actually where the phrase working for beans comes from. Because you're working just for the beans. But yeah, and then later it gets a little more standardized. You get day checks. You'd get a check for the number of days you worked, and you could take it to a bank and cash it.
Okay, just because I'm interested in labor history as well, are there any attempts at lumberjacks to unionize, or do they just accept this?
What a question. Not for a really long time. And it was a big question, and also one that I think every historian had flubbed. There'd been this sort of thing of like, oh, well, like, I guess they were happy. So they didn't, their first strike was in 1916. And basically previous to that, which is really late in the story, about it.
Because train workers and coal miners are already striking
way earlier. And the IWW had actually shown up in 1915 and tried to organize them. And a lot of the Wobblies had gone back and said, like, they're unorganizable. And one of the problems was that they really valued independence, and they already did what they called voting with their feet. If they didn't like a camp, they left. And the need for labor was high enough that you could guarantee yourself a job if you just walked off the job and went elsewhere. So in 1916, there was just a sort of perfect confluence, I don't know what word I was trying to make up there, confluence of things, the biggest of which was we got this, like, the hero of like every one of those dudes in Williamsburg. He was a union organizing lumberjack who was like 6'4" with a barrel chest and a deep voice. And he was like, he had some like weird socialist awakening in the fall of 1916. And so for the first time, there was somebody who looked and acted like the lumberjacks, who was willing to work with the national organization. Their general theory was if they unionized, that gave up their right to walk off camp. And they didn't want to give up their right to decide what work they chose. So they were pretty anti-union until that winter. That was the first big, and there were a few others. The mill people struck all the time, but not the lumberjacks.
Okay, time for the silly question. Is the Monty Python lumberjack song the most accurate representation, or the most accurate representation of lumberjacks?
Those were the two options I was given. I was about to check the time because I was like, how far did I get without Monty Python? At this point, I finally gave in, and it's on the first page of my introduction because I was like, I'm not allowed to talk about. In that Atlantic article, I didn't mention Monty Python, and I swear to God, half the comments are like, how has she not heard of Monty Python? No, the song. I actually think the song serves an important illustrative purpose, which is we think of that song, the reason that song's funny is because the cowboy like long ago got confused and became in many ways a gay symbol. The sailor as well. All of these sort of idealized types of American masculinity have these sort of confused histories where they've been appropriated by different groups and used in different ways. Lumberjacks, not entirely, like, don't at me. I know about men's workwear in the 80s and like gay signaling, I know. But largely has remained this sort of unquestioned thing. You know, we got Paul Bunyan, we got the brawny man, and we haven't really questioned or thought about it much. So it's really great. That song works so well because it is the person for whom it is most absurd that like he'd be wearing high heels, suspenders, and a bra. Like it just is the silliest version. And for it to be silly, short of like monster truck drivers, lumberjacks. So it's the most accurate. They did press a lot of what they actually largely hated the forest.
Well, I think, I mean, it brings up a really interesting point. I mean, like that's something that we've talked about with all of our guests is kind of dealing with, and something we talked about earlier too, is about kind of dealing with pop culture representations, and as a scholar kind of using those, but working through them to talk about how it's, you know, you were joking about it earlier, like it's more complicated than that, right? Because you know, anybody who kind of simplifies the past, I mean, they're selling something, right? A real scholar, a real historian will always say like it's about nuance, it's about complication, and that's different than explaining something in a you know, an understandable way, but understanding that there are differences there. So you know, we have these pop culture representations, these images in our head, you know, that you've been talking about, both of them, the Monty Python thing, but also kind of with the lumbersexual thing about beards, flannel, and stuff like that. Like, is that, like, where does that come from? And how do you use that, like, in your own teaching when you're kind of talking about these kind of things? Like, is it a straw man that you can kind of set up, that you can kind of knock down, or is it something else?
I find it this really complicated and weird and interesting thing. You know, this is like, that in some ways particularly and hilariously pertinent to Varsha living in Berkeley in LA, like a city devoted to the authentic and a city devoted to the inauthentic and the artificial. And for me, part of it is that I kind of think of authenticity as sort of bullshit, but I think where a lot of that comes from is this like need for the authentic in an increasingly artificial seeming world. And so there are these things you grab onto, and the way it works and is useful to me is like, I have to teach a lot the idea that gender is a construct, which historians are like happy to say gender is a social construct. And we're not saying gender's not a thing that has force and value in this world, but we're just saying like society's constructed for whatever. It all seems very straightforward, but I once got a faculty complaint about it because I was indoctrinating people with gender being a construct. But one of the things that's really easy to say is like, okay, like how does a manly man dress? Okay, how did he dress when he was your grandfather? Okay, how did he dress in 1900? Because we all can see like these visions change. So the sort of flannel workwear boots, one of the other problems about it is I've gotten a lot of flack for talking about it from people who like are loggers and are like, well, this is durable workwear. And I was like, I was never talking about you. Like, I was never talking about somebody who's wearing Carhartts because they work in a logging camp. Like, you wear whatever workwear you need to wear, but like, if you're coding, you don't need to be wearing workwear. You don't. You're like, there's a choice that you're making. And even if it's what my friend Margaret calls found clothing dressing, you still had to have that clothing on your bedroom floor to dress in it. So like at some point, someone made a choice to buy that. And like what motivated that choice? And I think those are very
Oh no, we lost her answer.
Are silly and frivolous, and what? Oh,
yeah, like I thought we.
Yeah, my connection got weird.
Okay.
one of the things that's really fun to like note, because it's so easy to note, is every time there's an economic crash in the 20th century, women's hemlines fall. And every time there's an economic boom in the 20th century, women's hemlines go up. And it's just a really nice thing to say, like, are you really telling me that none of this has anything to do with anything other than what individual women are choosing to do in any given moment? Like, do you really believe that the fact that when the economy crashed and there happened to be this large class of well-educated white dudes who started turning to traditional crafts as a way of like figuring out who they were in this world, are you telling me that they each individually decided to buy flannel? Like, do we really think that? Like, I know better than that. I don't want to sound like Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada, but like, somebody made these choices. You didn't just buy that blue sweater. They're worth looking at. And so it's fun to introduce students to the idea that like, okay, you really like baseball? You love baseball? Why don't you write me a 30-page paper on Red Sox Nation? Because there's something there and it's interesting and it's weird and there's all sorts of stuff. But you don't just happen to like the Red Sox. Like, Boston fans don't present the way they do for no reason.
Yes. Yeah, they didn't all just wake up one day and decide to become extra Boston. I feel like there is definitely a history there. I haven't read that history, but I feel like I want to read that history because of how much I like Boston. I should read that history.
Absolutely, and as a Yankees fan, there are a series of really bad life choices that lead up to that. I know that for a fact. So
centuries of life choices that led to somebody becoming part of Red Sox Nation.
That's absolutely right. Yes. Well, and I think it's so important too. I mean, what you're saying here is I think we tend to think about like, and what's been so great about this conversation is that you've talked about both the individual, right? The like individual lumberjacks, they have stories, right? And we have records of these things, and you can find these things, and it paints a picture about like what actual life was like. But at the same time, there are structures and systems that are at work here, right? That are influencing these things, right? So it's not just one or the other. It's all these things together.
Yeah, there's somebody, I saw a tweet the other day. There was like, one of the things I tell my students at the beginning is, it's not about men, it's about, when we're talking about these things, we're not blaming men, we're blaming patriarchy. We're not blaming white people, we're blaming white supremacy. And it doesn't make you less of an individual to live in a structure and think about what those structures are. Like, we live in structured environments, and then we are individuals who make choices in them. But
absolutely,
it doesn't devalue the individual to think about how they dealt with the structures they dealt with in their time, whether those structures were 9th century monastic structures or a logging camp. Like, none of that devalues individual action, individual choice. It just understands those larger things.
Yeah, and it's so clarifying in some ways to think about, like, individuals have a range of choices, but the range of choices that individuals have in different circumstances is dependent upon historical context, right? Like
and that's one of the things, to bring it back to a very current moment that keeps being worth remembering is there were people who knew slavery was evil in the 18th century. There were people who knew slavery was evil in the 19th century. So it is also a reason to think carefully about what the range of choices were and not excuse people based on historical, yes, they thought within the historical parameters they were given, but like, we've got to think carefully about what those parameters were and think about how people and why people made the choices they made. And think about them as individuals who were confronted with structures. Like, I don't think we have to necessarily cancel Thomas Jefferson because he was a slaveholder, but we cannot understand him if we don't understand him as a slaveholder.
Yes.
Like, we can't understand him if we don't understand he was a slaveholder who knew it was wrong, who was faced with choices and continued to do it. So that is a fundamental element of understanding this man, this president, these choices he made, these things he wrote. And if we try to write those things out because they're controversial or we try to simplify them, then we do end up with a black and white value judgment in which, you know, you get to either like 9th century Norwegian depictions of a white Christ are white supremacist, or, you know, it's heritage, not hate, either of which are absurd contentions. We have to be careful about it.
Yeah, because then you wind up, I mean, if you simplify things again, I mean, like, you wind up with hagiography, right? You wind up with hero worship, and that's it's not honest to the past, and it really kind of delimits. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to them,
well,
the people that we're
studying.
studying.
It's not fair to people who want to have heroes, because like I think it is. If you were taught these people are perfect, then you are nothing but imperfect. If you were taught there are people who are given a set of choices, and like people made some good ones and some bad ones, and were people. That allows us a much broader set of ways to relate to the past, ways to relate to our own history.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm looking at the time. We are unfortunately at the end of this episode of Drinking with Historians. Thank you again, my wonderful co-host Varsha, and our wonderful guest, Dr. Willa Hammitt Brown. Thank you so much for teaching us about lumberjacks and masculinity, and just so many things about like the joy of doing history in so many ways, and also for making fun of Varsha for not liking rum. So
that's important. Yes. I also want to know, I make fun of her slightly for being somebody who writes about dams and still felt the need to tell me she likes Donald Worcester, like I didn't know. Rivers.
Yeah, I'm mainly happy to find another William Cronin fan. I feel like there are a lot of us, but like we're very quiet about it for some reason. Like we're not loud enough about it. I feel like we can be louder.
No more.
Yeah.
And if that's that one takeaway, yell more about William Cronin. So take away. So thank you everybody, and especially for our guests for their wonderful questions. We still have a whole bunch of questions we just won't have time to get to, but thank you all for joining us. Join us next week, 6 o'clock. And this time, I said it wrong last time, but this time we'll be talking with Dr. Gautam Rao, who is going to be talking about the Supreme Court in American history and constitutional history and all sorts of interesting stuff that I as a medievalist know nothing about. So, but thank you again for joining us. Thank you for drinking with historians on this Friday afternoon. Have a great one. We'll see you next week.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.